Hello, fellow campers, readers, and lovers of campfire stories. I'm here, my name is Shannon Robertson, and I'm here today to read another one of my campfire stories to you. I'm doing something a little bit different this time, and it's because I'm not camping and don't have access to a campfire. I thought I'd let you enjoy my other artistic endeavor, which is my garden. The story that I'm going to read today is from my second book, More Campfire Stories from Northern Ontario. And it is a longer story than the ones that I've previously done. So um, I'd like to break it up into three parts for you. So the first video will be the first section of it. So this story was inspired by a stay that my family had at 𝗍𝗍 Park. And 𝗍𝗍 Park is a beautiful place with a long beach, some great trails to walk. So the story was inspired by a couple of the trails, but also a place that I know of that I haven't actually been brave enough to visit, but I know people who have, that is outside the park. And it's a landscape feature that's unusual. So I'm going to let the story speak to that. The other inspiration for the story is as my son Eric was growing up and we were camping each year at 𝗍𝗍 Park, we would attend programs about the previous history of the park, including and especially about the prisoner of war camp that used to be there. So that's the second inspiration, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in the story. So, because it's such a long story, I have read it previously at the park and shared it, and in doing so, I created a slightly abridged version of it. So today, rather than reading directly from the book, I'm going to read that version to you. All right, enjoy A Crack in Time. 𝗀𝗍𝗀 was beginning to have doubts about the merits of this particular adventure. It had seemed like an awesome idea when her dad had suggested it last night, a chance to do something interesting and exciting without the constant chatter or whining of her little sister April. But now, standing beside the railroad track, at the entrance to the huge fissure known locally as the Crack, with her mom and dad somewhere in the narrow dark gorge ahead of her, 𝗀𝗍𝗀's spirit of adventure was failing her, utterly. "Mom? Dad?" she called tentatively. "Do I have to come in there?" "It's pretty cool in here," her dad's voice replied. "I think you'll like it. Wow, there's a huge rock jammed in between the cliff faces right above my head. Come have a look." This description didn't actually do much to boost 𝗀𝗍𝗀's confidence. Giant rocks that could potentially topple onto your head were not what she'd envisioned when Dad had described the crack last night. A huge opening in the cliff, he'd said, big enough to walk right into, like a cave, but with no roof. But 𝗀𝗍 hadn't imagined it being this narrow, nor this cave-like. She wondered if she'd even be able to spread her arms out once inside. Although the cliffs seemed lower near the entrance, she could see that they rose steeply to the rounded, rocky hilltop far above. And to make matters worse, the entrance, an angular hole framed by rocks, lay beneath three immense squarish boulders piled one over the other. The bottom boulder at least had grass and harebells growing over its top, as if trying to assure 𝗀𝗍 that it had been there undisturbed for a long, long time. Somehow she wasn't totally convinced, even, or especially, after watching her parents squeeze into the burrow-like entrance, stepping down as they did so as if entering a deep, dark dungeon. "Don't worry," her mom called back. "That rock's not going anywhere for another 1,000,000 years or so." 𝗀𝗍𝗀's mom had an uncanny way of knowing what her daughter was thinking. 𝗀𝗍, 14 years old, found this unnerving. Also sometimes comforting, though she would never have admitted it to her mother. "And they don't get earthquakes around here, so that's not going to bring it down either." 𝗀𝗍 sighed, her mother having just vetoed another excuse for her not to enter the crack. "Come on, 𝗀𝗍," her father coaxed warmly. "You made the long trek to get here. You wouldn't want to waste it, would you?" It was true that it had been a long, hot, scratchy journey to this spot. The Crack, a long black fissure in the cliffs above the CP rail line, was not part of 𝗍𝗍 Park. It wasn't easy or altogether safe to get to, so not widely advertised. 𝗀𝗍 and her parents had waited in bare feet across the delta of the Little Pick River where it swept into Lake Superior, the current battling the white-capped breakers of the mighty lake. To avoid swimming the turbulent waters, they'd picked their way along a submerged sandbank, carrying their socks and shoes. Even so, they'd been wet to the waist when they emerged, breathless and icy-limbed, onto the driftwood-strewn beach of the opposite bank. And Kayleigh's long, sun-blonde hair would have been drenched too, if her dad hadn't caught her when one of Superior's waves almost knocked her into a deep trough. Once, on the other side, they'd worked their way upstream along the beach until it ran out, forcing them onto the rocks. They'd climb steadily up the lichen-encrusted slopes, sampling blueberries as they walked, their clothes drying in the hot blaze of the sun. Tina, Kayleigh's mom, wanted to spend as little time as possible on the railway track, so they didn't scramble up onto it until there was no choice. Even so, they'd had to walk along the gravelly, sun-baked railroad bed for several minutes, which made Tina nervous and just made Kayleigh feel sweaty. "I don't think this is very wise, Mike," Tina muttered as they tromped along, stepping from cement tie to tie. "It's only a little way down the line," her dad had replied, "and we can scramble off if a train comes." Her mom hadn't answered, but Kayleigh'd seen her lips close into a tight, thin line. Kayleigh knew this was her dad's idea. He'd remembered doing this hike as a boy and wanted Kayleigh to have the same cool experience. But she'd only realized, as they'd made their way across the river and up to the tracks, that her mom didn't really approve of this escapade. It had all begun when they first arrived at Naas Park 3 days ago, late in the afternoon. Kayleigh, and especially April, had been anxious to explore after the long car ride from Killarney Provincial Park that morning. But her dad had seemed the most excited, uncharacteristically suggesting they all check out the beach before setting up their tents and organizing the campsite. And what a beach it was! Kayleigh had been to beaches before, of course, like Woodbine near their home in Toronto. Beaches packed with umbrellas, deck chairs, sunbathing people, and refreshment stands. But never a beach like this one. Lake Superior gleamed under a hot August sun, deep indigo blending with aquamarine across the broad bay, and white-frothed waves pulsing onto the shore. A long, straight line of white sand, seemingly endless, framed the water, open and unpopulated save for a crazy mishmash of driftwood that was scattered everywhere. The only people Kayleigh could spy were a couple of heads bobbing in the waves to her right, and far to the east, 4 stick figures leaping and dancing, a family wading in the shallows. April had run straight for the water's edge, calling as she went. "Can we go swimming, Dad? Right now? Can we, Dad?" and pulling off her sandals to splash in the water before getting an answer. Mike called back, "Not yet, April. We're just taking a peek at the beach, remember?" But he laughed at his youngest daughter's easy enthusiasm and daring, reminding him of himself at that age. Kayleigh had watched her younger sister, but since it wasn't her nature to rush into things, she hung back with her dad. He'd turned right and looked down the length of the beach, pointing to a set of cliffs at its northwest end. "Can you see the railway track, Kayleigh, over there? And that dark vertical line in the cliffs going up from it? That's it. The place called the Crack that I explored with my dad when I was about your age." He told her this story before, when she was younger, and again on their car ride here. She'd always been amazed that her dad had grown up in Northern Ontario, and in a small place, Terrace Bay, so different from the bustling city she was used to. Her grandparents had moved back to Toronto, their hometown, as soon as her grandpa could get a posting there. Her dad, 16 at the time, had been pulled from the forests and wild lakeshore he loved to the gleaming towers and thrumming traffic of the city. So Kayleigh had never visited her dad's hometown, or the area around it, until now. And ever since their first day at Naas, Kayleigh's dad had been waxing on about how they must for sure hike to the Crack and possibly hike up through it before they went home. He'd even asked the park naturalists about it and learned that the chasm visible from the beach wasn't the one he remembered from his childhood. It was too narrow to enter easily. The true Crack wasn't really visible from the side of the river, lying further north along the tracks. You could make it out from the highest point of the Lookout Trail, but just barely, between scraggly jackpine tops, and only if you knew what you were looking for. Kayleigh's mom hadn't said much about Mike's hiking suggestion, and for the first few days they'd been busy just checking out the great trails within the park. On the first morning, they'd driven to Prisoner's Cove and hiked out to the point. Kaylee'd been enraptured by the mysterious forest along the trail, with elfin mosses carpeting the ground in the deep shade of spruces. But she was stunned to a gasping standstill at the end of the trail, where the forest opened onto a vista of sparkling blue lake, white-capped waves crashing over the smooth, rounded rocks of the shoreline. They'd picnicked there, with April and Kaylee dangling their toes in a shallow blue-green pool at the lake's edge, screeching and giggling together each time a frothy wave crashed over their legs or leapt onto their arms and faces. Kaylee had longed to continue on, leaping from ledge to ledge along the Under the Volcano Trail, whose signs she could see scattered among the rocks, leading hikers along the mountainous Coldwell Peninsula. But April had complained that she was hot and tired of walking and wanted to get back to the beach so she could practice tightrope walking on the long bleached white logs, or build a driftwood house with Dad, or especially crash through the enormous rolling waves. In fact, it had been all their mum could do to prevent April from jumping into Lake Superior at the point, where the sudden drop-offs and shore-battering waves were unsafe for any swimmer, never mind a 7-year-old novice one. April had whined all the way back to Prisoner's Cove, and their dad had even given her a piggyback ride on the beach part of the trail, just to get some peace and quiet. And that's pretty much how the whole week had gone. Everything Kaylee wanted to do was too long or too boring for April, or both. Kaylee found every trail to be an adventure, with something new to see around each bend. She loved reading signs and learning about the plants and animals, the ecology and geology of the area, even the human history. But April thought trails were boring unless they led to something exciting. She complained that the trail to the lookout was too long and too hot. They almost gave up and turned back, but where the trail became rocky steps along a steadily rising cliff, April became interested again because it was daring to be climbing a mountain. When they'd reached the top, April said it wasn't really a lookout at all because the lake was too far away and it didn't seem very high. Kaylee and her dad had searched for the distant view of the crack that the naturalists had mentioned. They'd glimpsed it with difficulty, looking through the trees to the west of their vantage point. On another day, they had followed a young man around the dunes and pine plantations near the visitor center, while he showed them remnants of buildings used when Nays had been a prisoner of war camp during the Second World War. Kaylee had been mortified when April whined constantly about how bored she was. Finally giving up, mostly for the sake of the other campers on the tour, their mum had begun to march April back to their campsite for a time out. Kaylee, watching them leave as she stood beside her dad, had cringed in embarrassment when April declared loudly in parting, "It's just a bunch of rusty old buildings and machines." For Kaylee, the final straw had been yesterday evening, when they'd attended a program put on by all the naturalists at the visitor center. Welcome to Nays Camp 100 was the program's title, and when Kaylee and her family had entered, a girl dressed as a man, with full khaki officer's uniform and even a black mustache, had indeed welcomed them as new prisoners of war, telling them what they would be expected to do and what their accommodations would be like in the camp. Kaylee was surprised at how much she enjoyed the drama, since she generally had little interest in anything military. Placed in the role of a prisoner of war, a POW, she began to empathize with the men who'd been held captive here. How would it feel to have a huge red circle sewn on the back of your shirt, a ready target in case you tried to escape? To eat whatever rations were provided, though apparently those were pretty good. To sleep in cold barracks in frigid northern Ontario winters, and to wonder constantly whether your family was safe far away in Germany. Would she have been able to endure it? It seemed a much better existence than many other prisoners of war had experienced in Germany and Japan, but still. She learned that most of the Germans at Camp 100 had been high-ranked officers, judged by their status and beliefs to be supporters of Hitler and his Nazi policies. This had earned them a black classification, indicating that they were higher risk than those prisoners classified as gray or white. Indeed, many of Camp 100's POWs had tried to escape, devising elaborate plots of digging tunnels with spoons and supporting the sandy earth with boards stolen from chairs and tables or from the undersides of buildings. A method that had worked at another northern camp not so far away, Angler, where a big group escape had made spectacular headlines at the time. 𝗀𝗟 had been deeply immersed in the play, absorbing the atmosphere provided by the naturalist banter, intrigued by the old photos they showed as if they were present-day images of the camp. Deeply immersed, that is, until April had ruined everything again. 𝗀𝗟 had managed to ignore her sister's fidgeting and sighing, having their mum as a buffer between them. But then April repeated the performance she'd made during the tour the day before, folding her arms over her chest, tilting her head to one side, letting out an exaggerated heavy sigh, and saying, oh so loudly and embarrassingly, "I'm bored." There followed a hushed conversation. Well, hushed on their mum's part, about proper audience manners, while 𝗀𝗟's face and ears reddened at the heads that were turning towards them, and at the main actor's good-natured attempt to work April's rudeness into the presentation. Bored, are you? Well, you won't be bored for long at Camp 100. You'll have kitchen duty and latrine duty, and probably be sent out in the winter to cut down trees and stack wood for the local logging company, Pigeon Timber. And if you're on good behavior, you'll have the opportunity to join the prisoners' orchestra, or play in the chess club, maybe even further your education with a course or two. April wasn't buying any of this. In fact, 𝗀𝗟 wasn't sure she'd even heard what the naturalist had said. By this point, she was whining and pulling at Tina's hand. "I'm tired of this. Let's go back to our camp, Mom." Dad, sitting on the other side of 𝗀𝗟, looked at his wife empathetically, but must have decided to leave this battle to her. He nodded when she leaned over and whispered, "I'll take her back. You two can stay for the rest." As April and their mum had headed out the back door, 𝗀𝗟 tried to bring her focus back to the show. Her father, always interested in World War II history, seemed to have no problem re-immersing himself in the drama. He was smiling and nodding at the actors. But 𝗀𝗟 was no longer enjoying the performance. Why did April have to ruin everything that 𝗀𝗟 liked? She could tell her mum had been interested in the evening's program too, and 𝗀𝗟 had liked laughing with her about the interpreter's antics. Why did her parents cater to her sister's whims? She knew what they'd say, what they always said. "April's too young to sit for so long," or "April doesn't understand this stuff yet." 𝗀𝗟 didn't agree. She'd never behaved like that at April's age. 𝗀𝗟 thought April was just being impatient and selfish. That's how 𝗀𝗟's week had been going. So when her dad mentioned the crack again last night and suggested they leave April in the care of Tina's best friend Sheila, she'd leapt at the chance to have her parents to herself for a while. Sheila and Bob had arrived that day with their brood of youngsters, all babies from 𝗀𝗟's perspective. The two young ones were cute, aged 2 and 4, but tiresome with their constant demands. April was fast friends with Sheila's oldest daughter, Autumn, so she didn't even think about a family outing once she'd been given the option of spending a beach day with her best buddy. "I don't want to see a big old hole in a rock," was her memorable quote, though in truth she hadn't had the option, Tina having held firm with Mike that April was too young to be hiking up uncertain mountain ravines. So, despite her own uneasiness with unknown spaces, especially dark, narrow, rock-enclosed ones, 𝗀𝗟 agreed to the outing immediately, then spent the rest of the evening worrying about it. She'd even lain awake for over an hour at bedtime, listening to trains and 18-wheelers rumble by up on the hills, convincing herself it would be exciting and fun, and that it would be great to have her parents to herself for a whole day. Which it was. But now, standing on the tracks, looking down at the large angular rocks she'd have to squeeze beneath to get into the crack, 𝗀𝗟 wondered if April would have been the right sister for this adventure. 𝗀𝗟 had never been brave like April. She was patient and determined when she wanted to learn something or get something done. So she'd had no problem hiking in the hot sun and scrambling up the rocky grade. But April would have loved to challenge the waves crossing the Little Pick River, whereas 𝗀𝗃, though much older, had been secretly terrified. And 𝗀𝗃 was terrified now, while April would have slid down the narrow entry without batting an eye. 𝗀𝗃 hated her fearfulness. She kept it hidden as best she could, embarrassed that she, a teenager, was more afraid of things than many kids younger than herself. She even tried to hide it from her dad, who never seemed to fear anything and loved new experiences, especially challenging ones. 𝗀𝗃 wanted to go into the crack, wanted to join her parents exploring it. She was super curious about what it looked like inside, with vertical cliffs rising on both sides, and she wondered if any plants were growing in there. But each time she planned to take a step forward, an icy wave of fear swept through her, like a glacier advancing from her heart to her toes, binding her to the gravel beneath her feet and making it impossible to move. "Are you coming, 𝗀𝗃?" wafted her mum's voice from the dark entrance. She could tell her mum was trying to sound encouraging, but 𝗀𝗃 detected a hint of worry, or maybe impatience. "Yes, no, I'm not sure," 𝗀𝗃 exclaimed, running her right hand through her hair in frustration. "It is pretty cool in here, 𝗀𝗃," her mum said. "I think you'll like it. Not as cramped as you'd expect. Your dad wants to walk a little further just to take a look. Do you want me to wait here until you come in? I'd crawl back out to help you, but I'm not sure I can. Not that it's hard to get in," she added hastily. "It's just easier coming down through the gap than it would be going up." 𝗀𝗃 gulped down the urge to beg her mum to try coming back out, and if she could, to wait out here with 𝗀𝗃 while her dad explored on his own. She hated being such a scaredy cat. "No, it's okay, Mum. You can go with Dad. I'll be in a minute." "Okay, 𝗀𝗃." There was a pause, and 𝗀𝗃 thought her mum must have moved ahead. Then, "You should probably move off the tracks, hun, okay? If you don't come in, that is. All right?" "Yeah, Mum, I will," 𝗀𝗃 said. Trains were the least of her worries at the moment, but her mum had a point. Several horizontal cables were strung across the entrance of the crack, from about hip height to the cliff's top. 𝗀𝗃's dad had said they were probably there to prevent rocks from falling onto the tracks, news that didn't lessen 𝗀𝗃's worries much. She wondered whether they were also meant to stop adventure seekers, but her dad said no, and they were certainly not hard to bypass. 𝗀𝗃 crouched down now, ducking her shoulders and head to pass beneath the lowest cable. She scooted down the gravel to the entrance, then halted again and took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so loudly she couldn't tell at first whether her mum was still close by, and she began to feel anxious that they'd really gone, hiking to the top without her. After a minute, 𝗀𝗃 could hear her parents' voices, sounding a bit echoey and distant. They must be walking slowly upwards, she thought, feeling lonely and left behind. She knew her dad really wanted to hike the whole cavern up to the very top of the cliff. What if they did, and left her here to hike back along the tracks alone? Where would they emerge and hike down? Would she ever find them, or would she have to wade back across the river by herself? Panic started to creep up 𝗀𝗃's body, as if the glacier were now retreating, but stopping at her heart, compacting it into an icy block in her chest. "Breathe," she reminded herself, "slow and steady." A trick her mum had taught her when she was little, younger even than April, and scared to try new activities in phys ed at school. "I can do this," she said out loud. The late morning sun shone hotly on her head and shoulders, and 𝗀𝗃 told herself how nice it would be to step down into the cool, cave-like environment. She drew one more breath and held it as she maneuvered her long, slim legs into the hole beneath the rock, turning herself around like she was going down a ladder, and placing first one foot, then the other, as she gripped the sharp edges of the rocky entrance with her hands. Because she was facing outward, the sunlight in front of her made it hard to see the rocky steps below, but she managed to make the final short drop her mum had warned her about. She swiveled away from the sunlit opening, expecting everything to seem dim until her eyes adjusted to the light. But instead, 𝗀𝗃 found blackness, pitch blackness. 𝗀𝗃's previously frozen heart now leapt to her throat in full-on panic. She could see nothing, and I mean not anything. Long ago, when 𝗀𝗄 was 7, just before April was born, her parents had taken her on a trip to South Dakota, and they'd gone on a tour of the underground caverns. 𝗀𝗄 remembered tagging along happily after her dad, gaping at the stalactites and stalagmites. Happily, that is, until the tour leader had said, "Ready, everyone?" and flicked a switch, banishing all light. The darkness was inescapable, so dense that it seemed to seep into your eyes and ears. 𝗀𝗄, too afraid to scream, had grasped for her dad's hand, and finding it, had waited in terror while the tour leader spoke, seemingly for hours, about how people could go crazy in such darkness. 𝗀𝗄's heart had pounded so hard she thought it would explode before the tour guide finally flicked the switch once more, releasing them from the prison of blackness. Tears had finally gathered in her eyes, and she'd had to choke them back, afraid of looking like a baby in front of the other tourists. She'd honestly thought she might die of fear if the darkness had lasted any longer. That kind of darkness was what 𝗀𝗄 was experiencing now in the crack. She fought to keep back the terror she'd felt when she was 7. How could it be this dark, she thought. Mom would surely have warned her about it. And what about the opening at the top? It was nearly midday with the sun shining brightly outside. And this was no cave. Her dad had said the crack was like a very long, very narrow canyon. 𝗀𝗄 looked up, searching for a slim band of blue sky, but it was as if her eyes were shut. She pivoted back to where she knew the opening must be, and was dismayed to find that the sunlit hole to the outer world had vanished. Wait a minute. There was an opening there, but only dimly visible, as if it was night outside, and a dark night at that. 𝗀𝗄 drew in a deep breath, trying to think logically. Where were her parents? She listened, but couldn't hear any sign of them. Mom? Dad? 𝗀𝗄's ears yearned for the ordinary friendly response of, "Over here, honey." Yet somehow she knew it wasn't going to come. The silence felt hollow. Stillness, emptiness, engulfed her. A sob began to rise in 𝗀𝗄's throat, and she was just about to give in to it when a bright thought sparked in her mind. Flashlight! She'd felt foolish that morning when she tucked it into the inside pocket of her day pack between granola bars and Band-Aids. Now she inwardly thanked herself as she swung the one-strapped pack around her body and unzipped it. By touch, taking care not to spill the rest of the pack's contents in the dark, she located the beacon and switched it on. A smidgen of relief seeped into 𝗀𝗄's lungs as the cone of light cut through the black, illuminating her surroundings. Vertical rock walls, grayish-black and sharply chiseled, rose on both sides, and seemed to stretch forward endlessly in front of her. The floor of the ravine, a few feet wide, was also stone, and it glistened here and there as if water had recently trickled in. 𝗀𝗄 suddenly realized how cool it was inside the crack. Not just cool, it was downright cold. Reaching back into her pack, with the aid of her flashlight this time, she pulled out a much-crumpled nylon windsuit. 𝗀𝗄 knew the white nylon, with its gold accent stripes down legs and sleeves, was impractical for camping. Her mom had made that very clear when 𝗀𝗄 chose it. But she'd loved the look of it, and after much pleading, her mom had relented. Like the flashlight, 𝗀𝗄 felt silly stashing the suit into her pack on a warm August day, but now, as she slipped the pants over her shorts and zipped the jacket up to her chin, she was happy to have it. Warmer now, 𝗀𝗄 aimed her light back at the rocky walls. They were damp too, like the floor. I don't remember any rain this week, even at night, she mused. She wondered if the water came from underground streams, but it seemed to be everywhere. She shook her head. This was not the puzzle she needed to solve at the moment. Where had her parents gone? Why did it seem to be night? And most of all, what should she do next? 𝗀𝗄 took a few cautious steps forward, trying not to slip on the damp rock. She was trying to decide whether she should venture further in to look for her mom and dad, or turn around and try to climb back out. But something happened then that banished these questions from her mind and made her stop still as a statue. Crack! Kaylee was certain the loud scraping sound that echoed through the gorge had not been made by something inanimate, not the brushing of a wind-blown branch on stone, nor the shifting of ancient rocks against one another. No, this sounded like a foot shifting, accidentally scraping loose stone against the solid rock floor of the ravine. What was in here with her? Images of long-clawed bears and snarling lynxes flashed through Kaylee's mind as she quickly trained her light beam up the length of the tunnel, searching for the source of the sound. So that's the end of the first part of the story, A Crack in Time. I'm glad you could join me for this reading. If you like the story and would like to hear the next part of it, you can follow the link here, and there's a link in the description below as well. If you would like to read that story or similar stories, you can find my books, Campfire Stories from Northwestern Ontario and More Campfire Stories from Northern Ontario, at Chapters in Thunder Bay and other local stores. And you can find it online at Amazon. And there's information also provided on my More Campfire Stories Facebook page, as well as my website, Fairy Flower Press. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story, and hope to see you again for the rest of this story and my other stories that I've posted. In the meantime, happy reading, happy camping, and happy storytelling. See you soon. Bye for now.